On the battlefield that night, gun smoke and explosions echoed through the darkness. In the middle of chaos, a female soldier lay collapsed, blood soaking through her uniform, but her lips remained sealed, not a single cry of pain. Her teammates thought she was about to give up when the SEAL medic knelt beside her, looking closely at her face. He froze, whispering with a trembling voice, "My God, this isn't just anyone. This is..." The entire squad went silent, their quiet broken by a past no one expected. Her name was Mariana Flores, 29 years old, with long brown hair that she kept braided back, a slender frame that moved quietly through the base, and gentle eyes that seemed to see everyone's pain before her own. Most soldiers noticed her softness first, the way she spoke quietly, the way she never complained, the way she always seemed to fade into the background. What they missed was the steel beneath that silence. Mariana had been assigned to logistics support, the kind of role that kept her away from frontline combat and close to supply runs, ammunition distribution, and medical supplies. It wasn't glamorous work, but she performed it with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. "She's too soft for this," Private Rodriguez would say when he thought she couldn't hear. "Belongs in an office somewhere, not out here." Sergeant Davis was more direct during morning briefings. "Don't expect her to handle the pressure when things get real. Some people just aren't built for combat." His eyes would linger on Mariana just long enough to make his point clear to everyone in the room. But Mariana never defended herself, never argued. She simply continued doing what she did best, taking care of people in ways they didn't always notice. When Private Johnson ran out of water during a desert patrol, Mariana quietly handed him her entire ration without a word. When Corporal Martinez tore his sleeve on razor wire, she used fabric from her own shirt to bind the wound until they could get back to base medical. When the young translator caught fever during a sandstorm, she sat with him through the night, using her own blanket to keep him warm while she shivered in the cold. These weren't heroic acts in the traditional sense. No one wrote commendations for sharing water or giving up clothing. No medals were awarded for staying awake to watch over a sick soldier. But every person she helped remembered. They remembered her voice in the darkness, steady and calm. They remembered her hands, always gentle even when performing difficult tasks. They remembered that she never asked for recognition. On her uniform, just above her heart, was a small piece of silver fabric that looked old and worn. The edges were frayed and it was sewn on in a way that suggested she didn't want anyone to examine it too closely. Most soldiers assumed it was some kind of personal memento, maybe from family, maybe from a previous unit. None of them thought to ask about it. The fabric covered something underneath, something she kept hidden beneath layers of regulation clothing and careful positioning. When she changed uniforms, she did it quickly and privately, making sure no one caught a glimpse of what lay beneath. During a particularly difficult supply run through hostile territory, the convoy came under mortar fire. While other soldiers dove for cover, Mariana methodically secured the medical supplies, making sure nothing critical was lost in the chaos. Shrapnel cut her arm, but she wrapped it quickly and continued working. Later, as she treated minor wounds in the back of the transport vehicle, Private Williams watched her work with growing respect. "You know what you told me last week?" he said quietly, wincing as she cleaned a cut on his forehead. "You said, 'I'm used to bearing pain in silence, as long as others get to live.' I thought that was just some kind of philosophy." Mariana finished bandaging his wound with the same gentle precision she brought to everything. She didn't respond to his words, but something in her eyes, just for a moment, flickered with a deeper knowledge, a harder truth that she kept buried beneath layers of quiet service. Williams would later tell anyone who'd listen. There was something about the way she said it, like she'd learned that lesson the hard way, in places most of us couldn't imagine. The ambush came without warning during what should have been a routine patrol through a village they'd secured months earlier. The first explosion sent their lead vehicle spinning into a ditch, And within seconds, the entire convoy was pinned down by coordinated small arms fire from multiple positions. "Contact! Contact! We're taking fire from all sides!" The radio crackled with urgent voices as SEALs scrambled for defensive positions behind whatever cover they could find. This wasn't a random insurgent attack. The enemy had planned this carefully. Multiple firing positions, overlapping fields of fire, and what sounded like professional coordination. Within minutes, it became clear they were facing trained fighters with military-grade weapons and tactical knowledge. "RPG, take cover!" Sergeant Davis's voice cut through the chaos as a rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the side of their transport vehicle. Mariana was in the supply truck when the attack began. The first explosion threw her against the metal wall, and she felt something warm running down her side. When she looked down, she saw blood spreading across her uniform. Shrapnel had found its way through the truck's armor. The pain hit her like a sledgehammer, but she made no sound. While other wounded soldiers called for medics or cursed their injuries, Mariana simply pressed her hand against the wound and began moving toward where she could help others. "She's hit!" someone shouted, pointing at the blood spreading across her shirt. "How bad?" came the response. A young soldier looked at the amount of blood and shook his head. "She's done for! Don't waste time on her!" Another voice, harder and more dismissive. "She's just logistics anyway. Focus on the real fighters." But Mariana continued moving, ignoring the fire around her, ignoring the blood, focusing only on reaching the wounded SEALs who needed immediate medical attention. The pain was extraordinary. She could feel the shrapnel grinding against her ribs with every breath. But she'd learned long ago how to function through agony that would incapacitate most people. That's when the SEAL medic, Petty Officer Marcus Chen, spotted her crawling toward a wounded soldier while leaving a trail of blood behind her. "Ma'am, you need to stay down," he called out, sliding across the ground to reach her. "You're bleeding bad." When Chen reached her, he immediately began assessing her wound. As he carefully moved aside the blood-soaked fabric of her uniform, something caught his eye that made him freeze completely. There, partially visible beneath the torn material, was a tattoo that made his blood run cold. It was small, precise, and unmistakable. The emblem of Kraken Unit, one of the military's most classified special operations groups. But this wasn't just any Kraken tattoo. Below the unit insignia were 3 small marks that Chen recognized from intelligence briefings he'd attended years earlier. Only one person had ever earned those specific marks. "No way," he whispered, his hands trembling as he stared at the partially visible ink. "You can't be. There's no way you're..." Mariana's eyes met his, and for just a moment the mask of quiet logistics soldier slipped away. Chen found himself looking into the eyes of someone who had seen things, done things, survived things that were only whispered about in classified briefings. Despite the pain that had to be tearing through her body, despite the blood loss that would have most people screaming or unconscious, Mariana was completely focused on the wounded soldiers around them. She pointed toward a SEAL who was bleeding from his leg, then toward another who was trapped under debris. Her message was clear. Help them first. "Ma'am, you're losing too much blood," Chen insisted, trying to apply pressure to her wound. "I need to treat you now." But Mariana shook her head silently, pointing again toward the other wounded. Even as her own life force leaked out onto the desert sand, her priority remained the same. Everyone else first, herself last. The firefight continued around them, bullets snapping overhead and explosions shaking the ground. Other wounded soldiers were crying out, some calling for their mothers, others screaming in pain. But Mariana remained completely silent, not making a sound despite having what Chen could now see was a potentially fatal wound. In his years as a combat medic, Chen had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers. He'd seen grown men break down completely from injuries less severe than what Mariana was enduring. He'd watched tough veterans sob from pain that was a fraction of what she had to be experiencing. Yet here she was, bleeding out in the middle of a firefight, more concerned about other people's injuries than her own, maintaining perfect silence despite agony that should have been unbearable. As Chen worked to stop her bleeding, His mind raced through everything he'd heard about the legendary sniper known only as Raven. The stories seemed like myths, impossible shots at impossible distances, surviving behind enemy lines for weeks at a time, enduring torture without breaking, operating in complete silence regardless of circumstances. But as he looked at Mariana's tattoo, as he watched her ignore her own potentially fatal wound to focus on helping others, as he witnessed her maintain perfect composure in circumstances that would break most people, Chen realized he wasn't treating just another wounded soldier. He was trying to save a ghost. Chen would later tell the story this way. I'd heard legends about a silent legend who could shoot with perfect accuracy and endure pain without making a sound. The tattoo on her shoulder confirmed it. I was looking at her. The enemy was closing in. Through the smoke and chaos, Chen could see muzzle flashes getting closer as hostile fighters advanced on their position. The SEALs were putting up fierce resistance, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Several team members were wounded, ammunition was running low, and their defensive perimeter was shrinking by the minute. "We need to fall back," Sergeant Davis shouted over the gunfire, "but we can't move the wounded." It was the nightmare scenario every unit feared, trapped with casualties they couldn't abandon, facing an enemy that was methodically destroying their defenses. In a few more minutes, the hostile fighters would overrun their position completely. That's when Mariana did something that defied everything her teammates thought they knew about her. Despite the blood still flowing from her wound, despite the shrapnel grinding against her ribs with every movement, she forced herself into a sitting position. Her face was pale from blood loss, but her eyes had taken on a focus that Chen had never seen before, not in her, not in anyone. Next to her lay an SR-25 sniper rifle that had belonged to one of the wounded SEALs. Without hesitation, Mariana reached for the weapon with hands that should have been shaking from shock and blood loss, but were instead steady as stone. "What are you doing?" Chen whispered, trying to push her back down. "You need to stay still." But Mariana was no longer the quiet logistics soldier who had distributed supplies and stayed in the background. As she brought the rifle to her shoulder, something fundamental changed in her bearing, in her breathing, in the way she held herself. The transformation was so complete that Chen barely recognized her as the same person. Through the scope, she scanned the battlefield with predatory patience, identifying targets with an efficiency that spoke of countless hours of training and years of experience. The enemy sniper who had been picking off their team members was positioned approximately 800 meters away, well concealed behind rubble but not invisible to someone who knew how to hunt other snipers. Mariana's breathing slowed to a rhythm that seemed almost mechanical. Her heart rate, despite the trauma and blood loss, dropped into a zone where the smallest tremor could mean the difference between life and death. Time seemed to stretch as she made microscopic adjustments, calculating wind speed, distance, and the movement patterns of her target. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out clear and true across the battlefield. Through the scope, she watched the enemy sniper's rifle tumble away from its position as her bullet found its mark with surgical precision. The entire SEAL team went silent for a moment, processing what they just witnessed. "Did she just..." someone started to ask. But Mariana wasn't finished. Moving the rifle with fluid grace despite her injuries, she identified a machine gun position that had been suppressing their movements. Her second shot silenced it permanently. Her third took out a spotter who had been directing enemy fire. "Jesus Christ," Sergeant Davis breathed into his radio. Is that Raven?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the battle. Every special operations soldier in the Middle East had heard the stories about Raven, the ghost sniper who could make impossible shots and disappear without a trace. Raven was the nightmare that enemy commanders whispered about, the legend that made seasoned fighters relocate their positions based on rumors alone. Chen watched in amazement as Mariana continued her methodical work. Despite losing blood that should have rendered her unconscious, despite pain that should have been incapacitating, she was systematically dismantling the enemy's tactical advantage one precise shot at a time. The truth, when it finally came together in Chen's mind, hit him like a physical blow. Mariana Flores wasn't just a logistics soldier who happened to be good under pressure. She was Raven, the legendary sniper from Kraken Unit's most classified operations. Her official record, if anyone had access to it, would show confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters, survival in hostile territory for weeks at a time, and a reputation that had changed the tactical landscape in 3 different theaters of operation. But that was before Kandahar, before her entire team was eliminated in a coordinated attack while she was away on reconnaissance, before she watched intelligence photos of her teammates' bodies being displayed by enemy fighters, before she decided that she was tired of being death incarnate and wanted to try saving lives instead of taking them. She'd left the sniper program quietly, accepting reassignment to logistics and swearing never to touch a rifle again. For 2 years, she kept that promise, finding satisfaction in keeping soldiers supplied, fed, and healthy, instead of eliminating their enemies from impossible distances. But tonight, when her new family was about to be overrun, when the people she'd sworn to protect were facing annihilation, Raven had returned from retirement. "Raven," came a voice over the radio, someone from command who had finally put the pieces together. "Raven, this is actual. We owe you the lives of the entire squad." Within minutes, the tactical situation had completely reversed. Without their sniper support and key firing positions, the enemy attack began to collapse. The surviving hostile fighters, realizing they were now being hunted by a legend they'd only heard about in fearful whispers, began a hasty retreat. The SEALs who had dismissed her as just logistics, who had written her off as too soft for real combat, now stared at her in stunned silence. Some tried to speak, to apologize, to express their gratitude, but words seemed completely inadequate. Sergeant Davis, the man who had publicly questioned her ability to handle pressure, approached her with visible humility. "Flores, Raven, I don't know what to say." Mariana carefully set down the rifle and looked at him with those same gentle eyes that had always been there. Blood was still seeping through her makeshift bandages, but her voice was steady and calm. "I just did what needed to be done, Sergeant." As Chen worked frantically to stabilize her wounds for evacuation, he could hear radio chatter confirming what he'd suspected. They were treating a living legend who had chosen to disappear into anonymity rather than live with the weight of what she'd been forced to become. The woman who had quietly distributed supplies and stayed in the background, who had endured dismissal and condescension without complaint, who had chosen healing over killing for 2 years, had saved all their lives in less than 10 minutes. If you believe that silence can sometimes be the loudest scream, that strength hides in the most unexpected places. Type, "I owe a debt" in the comments below. Mariana survived the surgery, though the doctor said it was touch and go for several hours. When she finally woke up in the field hospital, the first thing she did wasn't ask about her own condition or complain about the pain. Instead, she quietly sat up and began helping change bandages for other wounded soldiers, as if the most remarkable display of marksmanship anyone had witnessed was just another day at work. The base had changed while she was unconscious. Word of what happened during the ambush had spread through the entire command structure, and suddenly, everyone wanted to know about the quiet logistics soldier who had saved an entire SEAL team. But Mariana deflected the attention with the same gentle persistence she'd always shown, redirecting conversations toward the wounded who needed care and the supplies that needed organizing. The transformation in how others treated her was immediate and profound. The bulletin board outside the mess hall now displayed a handwritten message: "Bleeding but silent, Raven never left us." Someone had drawn a small sniper scope next to a medical cross. It wasn't official military communication, just soldiers trying to process what they'd learned about someone they thought they knew. Sergeant Davis, who had publicly questioned her toughness, now made it a point to personally thank her every morning. The SEALs who had survived the ambush looked at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude that they struggled to put into words. Even the commanding officers, when they came to visit the wounded, spoke to her with a level of respect usually reserved for decorated heroes. But perhaps the most significant change was in the wounded themselves. Soldiers who lay on stretchers in the medical tent now understood that the gentle hands treating their injuries belonged to someone who had done the impossible to keep them alive. There was a different quality to their trust, a deeper appreciation for the care they were receiving. Private Williams, whose life Mariana had saved during the ambush, approached her during evening rounds. His arm was in a sling, but his eyes were bright with something that hadn't been there before. A kind of profound respect mixed with disbelief. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, "I keep thinking about what you said before, about being used to bearing pain in silence so others could live. Now I understand what you meant." Mariana smiled, the same gentle smile she'd always worn, the one that had made people assume she was just another support soldier. "Everyone has their way of serving, Williams. This is mine." But they both knew it was more than that. Much more. Late that night, when the base had settled into its familiar rhythm of guard rotations and quiet preparation for whatever tomorrow might bring, Mariana sat alone in her quarters. She gently touched the Kraken Unit tattoo that had been hidden for so long, the ink that marked her as one of the most lethal soldiers her country had ever produced. She thought about Miguel, her spotter, who had died in the Kandahar attack, about Sarah, her team leader, who had been planning to retire and teach high school, about David, the youngest member of their unit, who had carried pictures of his 3 sisters in his helmet. "Miguel," she whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible above the distant hum of generators. "I kept quiet like you taught me. I stayed silent and I kept them safe." For 2 years, she had tried to bury Raven with her fallen teammates. She had chosen logistics over lethality, support over shooting, silence over the screams of dying enemies. But tonight had proven something she'd always known but hoped never to test again. Sometimes the greatest act of service is pulling a trigger with perfect precision, for the right reasons, to protect people who can't protect themselves. Type, "I will serve quietly if you believe that sometimes silence is the strongest protection of all." This isn't just a story about a soldier who hid her deadly past to become a healer. This is a story about the power of silence, about the strength that lives quietly in people we overlook, about the choice between who we were and who we choose to become. In a world that mistakes noise for strength and visibility for value, Mariana Flores reminds us that the most powerful people are often the quietest ones. She chose to serve in shadows rather than spotlights, to heal rather than harm, to support rather than lead, until the moment when leadership meant picking up a rifle to save lives. The real lesson here extends far beyond military service. It's about the people around you right now who might be carrying extraordinary capabilities, painful histories, or hidden strengths that could change everything if circumstances demanded it. That quiet coworker who never speaks up in meetings might be the person who holds everything together during a crisis. That gentle nurse who always has time for difficult patients might be someone who survived experiences that would break most people. That reserved neighbor who waves politely every morning might be the person who runs toward danger when others run away. We live in a society that confuses loudness with competence, aggression with ability, and recognition with worth. But true strength often whispers. Real competence frequently hides behind humility. And the most valuable people are often those who choose when to reveal their capabilities and when to keep them concealed. Mariana's story teaches us never to underestimate the silent ones. Never dismiss someone because their current role doesn't match your assumptions about their past. Never assume that someone who chooses gentleness hasn't earned the right to be fierce when fierceness is required. But perhaps most importantly, her story is about the choice between destruction and protection, between taking life and preserving it. For 2 years, Raven chose to bury her lethal skills and dedicate herself to keeping soldiers supplied and healthy. She didn't become a logistics soldier because she couldn't be a sniper. She became a logistics soldier because she believed the world needed more people building things up rather than tearing them down. Think about the quiet servants in your own life. The people who work behind the scenes, who stay late to help others, who solve problems without seeking credit. Remember that many of them chose that path not because they lack other options, but because they understand that real strength is often about choosing not to use all the power you possess. But remember too that when everything is on the line, when the people they care about are in mortal danger, these quiet guardians might surprise you with capabilities forged in experiences you never imagined they'd survived. Maybe tomorrow you'll meet someone sitting quietly in a corner, seemingly insignificant. Don't underestimate them. Because when darkness falls and lives hang in the balance, they might be the one who steps forward with skills that save everyone. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe to NL Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.